That picture was taken over 60 years ago when I was a young cowboy up in Wyoming. It's about that time that I first got interested in the Indian Sign Language. People often ask me, well, how in the world did you ever get interested in this sign language to such an extent that you wanted to make a study of it? Well, let's say in the first place I did it as a matter of necessity. I was a young cowboy then, working for some of the big cattle outfits, and there was open range in that country, and of course cattle ran for miles and miles. And then this company that I worked for, this big cow outfit, leased thousands of acres on the Wind River Reservation. So we had to ride for stock over there among the Indians. Well, if you were looking for a horse or looking for stray cattle or something of the sort, and you met an Indian on the trail, you had to have some way to talk to him. Very few of those old fellows spoke English. And you know, the average cowboy, well, in spite of what Owen Wister and all the writers say, he was a pretty crude sort of a guy, you know, and thought he was pretty smart. And if he'd meet an Indian on the trail, the first thing he'd say is, "Hi, John, how the hell are you? Where are you going?" And the Indian, of course, in all his dignity, would just roll up and look at him, never say a word. Then if he said, "Do you speak English?" or something, and the Indian would say, "No, sabe." Well, I saw very soon, I saw them using their hands, because on the Wind River Reservation we had two tribes, the Arapahoes and the Shoshones. They spoke different languages. You know, among the Plains Indians, people say, why did they need a sign language? They could talk, couldn't they? Yes, but you see, all the different tribes spoke different languages. They were not dialects, mind you. They were separate and distinct languages. So years ago, these Plains Indians, who were nomadic, of course, following the buffalo up and down the plains and back and forth, east and west, they would meet different tribes speaking different languages. And they found that they had to have some sort of an intertribal means of communication. And that's how this sign language came about. That's the sign for it. If you talk signs, you do it like that, with the hands. Well, these signs probably began in pantomime, because we know, well, certain things that a white man will do. He'll say yes and no. Well, in the sign, it's more or less the same. This means yes, and this means no. Same thing, see? So I realized that in order to talk to some of these Indians, I better pick up a few of these signs. So if I'm looking for cattle now to look, it's the idea of both eyes, you see, staring ahead. Now, if you look all around. That's also the sign to hunt. But if you're hunting or looking for horse, now a horse is something that you ride. Get on him, stride him, and ride him. A cow, of course, has thin horns. So if you're looking for cattle or you're looking for a horse or horses, you have to find out, if you meet an Indian who can't speak English, how you'd say that in signs. Well, the first thing I learned then was to ask a question. You want to know whether he's seen a horse or seen these cattle? Now, an Indian has two hearts. One says yes, and one says no. Now, he doesn't know which one to believe. So it's, you know, the French have a word, comme ci, comme ça. Which way is it, yes or no? So, in order to ask a question, you preface it with this sign. How about it? A horse. You see him? Now, to give the color of a horse, color is generally done by rubbing the tips of the fingers of the right hand over the back of the left, and then pointing to some particular color. But in the case of a pinto horse, for instance, they would say he's a horse spotted, like that. Or cattle. Now, if it was one cow or one horse you're looking for, you'd say one horse. Now, the only difference in the color is that way, but there's one sign they use for black, by patting the back of the hand like that in a rotary motion. So you'd say, how about it? Did you see a horse black? And he'd tell you yes or no. And the first thing an Indian would do after you started talking signs, that broke the ice, and he'd talk to you about most anything you wanted to find out, you know. And that was the way it then began. As soon as I learned to say how, Now, to speak or to name anything is done like this. The words come from the mouth, you see. So I'd say, how do you speak that particular object? Go back to the buffalo. How would you speak in sign language for the buffalo? Now, that's the sign of the buffalo, the big, thick horns. Now, originally, the sign for that buffalo was just that way, with the two horns. But when they saw these covered wagon trains come out, drawn by the oxen, these oxen had thin horns, you see, so they changed the sign for the buffalo and made it a big, thick horn. So you say, what's the sign for that thing? And he says, like that. Or you'd say, what's the sign for that dog? And point to the dog. Well, years ago, long before the Indians had horses, the dogs dragged the travois. Now, the travois is those two poles that you've seen very often in pictures that carry all their baggage. It was their baggage wagon. And the dogs dragged the travois, and that is the mark of the two poles of the travois. And even though they have abandoned the use of dogs dragging the travois, that still is the mark. It's come clear down, and that's the sign for the dog. And the other animals, if you're talking about the elk, men going hunting for elk, the elk has big spread antlers. Now, if it's antelope, the antelope only has two prongs, you know, so they make it that way. If it's a bear, the bear, of course, the idea is that he rears up like that with his paws up, and that is the sign for the bear. So you've got the elk, the buffalo, the antelope, and now you get to, if you're talking about the difference between some of these big animals, up in that north country, you've got the moose. Well, I've come across different signs for that. Some Indians have called him a water elk, an elk that goes into the water. Now, water is something that you scoop up with your hand and drink. Now, water in a line would be a river. Water in a circle is a lake. And the ocean is the water that's big, the big water. So to get back to this moose, they would call him an elk, water he goes into. Now, another tribe would call it something else, like this, for instance. They would make the sign for the antler, and then by holding both hands up to denote that great flange of horn that the moose has, they'd say, that way. So they would differentiate, then, you see, between the elk and the moose. Now, your wolf or your coyote, he's a pretty smart fellow. And that means the wolf. They also will use that sign for the Pawnee Indian, who were scouts for the white men for so long. They call them the Wolf Indians. Or they will use it for a scout who's scouting for the army. And they'll throw that hand ahead with the two fingers extended. There's so many signs that you have to look for that are made with two fingers like that. But that wolf sign is sort of alongside the ear and shove it forward like that. Now, if you take that same sign and rotate it, instead of shoving it forward, it means medicine. And if you use that sign in front of the lips and have it, as you spiral it, go up, that means to sing, music. Any kind of music is this way. And then, as I say out here, opposite the shoulder, it means medicine. Now, an Indian's medicine is his religion. Good medicine, bad medicine. Good is everything is smooth and it's all right, you see. Now, you have to watch a thing in signs. It's the emphasis that you put on the sign. It isn't just the idea of making the sign. If you try to describe a sign like this, you'd say, hold the right hand in front of the breast with the back of the hand up and move it forward. Well, it would be just like that. But an Indian does it gracefully, and he does it almost with a circular movement. Now, he also puts emphasis on it. If something is particularly good, he say, how is it? And he said, good. I say, well, how about that? You see, ask him a question. He say, that's good. That's good. But if you say to that same Indian, you come along with me. Now, this means to go with. Place the left hand out this way, the index finger of the right hand lay against it. That means you're together. You're going someplace. You go with me. You come with me to my house. Now, the idea of a house is that the logs are laid up. You see, the corner of the house, because the first houses they saw were log cabins. to my house. Now my house, this is the sign for possession. That's mine, I have it. Both hands like that as though you took hold of something and just possessed it, that's all. So house, mine, to my house. And you sit down. Now to sit down is this way. To get up, you rise like a man. That's the sign for a man, for instance. And sit down. And we'll take beef. That's same now. Now so you use the sign for the beef cattle. Beef, bread. Now the first time they ever saw bread, the Mexicans had taught those southern Indians to make bread like they make the tortillas. And they taught it to the northern Indians, and these Indians up north still make that same sign. That's the sign for bread. Now coffee, which they got from the agencies later on, was a bean, a small bean, you see, just as though, you have to use a certain amount of pantomime with this and use your imagination on it. If you want to talk about coffee, what are you going to do? The first thing is the bean. The next thing is they gave them the coffee mill that you grind up and drink. So you wouldn't even have to use the sign for the bean, but you'd say coffee mill and you drink it. So I'll give you, now to give is that way. Just take the hand extended that way and throw it out toward the person. That means I give you. Now if he's going to give me something, you reverse the hand and I say give me. Or I'll say I'll give you. Give me. So I say to this Indian, you come to my house and I'm going to give you beef, bread, potatoes, just like take your fist and just put the fingers of the right hand around it, and naturally, if you're talking about eating, he knows what that is. That's a potato and coffee, and you'll eat till you're filled up to there. Now this is the sign to eat, you see. Drink is with water. To eat is as though you compress the fingers of the right hand like that, and you eat. Now, to have enough, sufficient, if you ask him if he's had enough to eat, he will do that by opening the thumb and index finger of your right hand, and just as though his whole gullet was filled clear up to the chin, he'd say, no, I've had enough. Oh, that's good. Then, when he says, if you say, you do that, he would say, good. But he wouldn't just then say, good. He'd say, ah, that's damn good, you know. Now, those are some of the signs that you have to learn to start. Now, these Indians, as I remarked a little while ago, their reason for the sign language was because of the different languages of the different tribes. If, for instance, they met a Sioux. Now, when the Sioux didn't belong on the plains originally, you know. He was clear back in that country around the Great Lakes, around Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. But he was pushed out onto the plains by the Chippewas, who were very numerous. The Chippewas, by the way, another name for them is the Ojibwe, and they are the Indians about whom Longfellow wrote when he wrote Hiawatha. Well, the Chippewas pushed the Sioux out onto the plains. Now, the Sioux had been in contact with white traders, and he had traded for a long bead, the dentillion shell. The traders had that, and it was great trade goods. So he made a necklace of it. And he wore these necklaces of dentillion shells. Well, now, some people I've read where people have interpreted that sign as meaning the sign for the Sioux is that way.